Room 217 has never had a patient die alone, and I know exactly who stays with them in their final moments. I've been an ICU nurse for 12 years, and I thought I'd seen everything. But there's something about room 217 that defies every medical explanation I've ever learned. Patients in that room, people who've never met each other, who come from different backgrounds and beliefs, all describe the same visitor. A kind elderly woman in a blue dress who sits beside them when death is near. And the most unsettling part, she's been dead since 1987. This story was originally shared on Reddit by u/nightshiftnurse_n in the r/nursing community. And when I read it, I knew I had to share my own experience because I worked in that same hospital. I know room 217. I know what happens there. And after what I discovered in those old hospital records, I can never look at that room the same way again. It started during my 3rd month working the night shift at Riverside General Hospital. The ICU was always intense, but nights had their own special kind of pressure. Fewer staff, sicker patients, and that heavy silence that seemed to press down on everything after visiting hours ended. Room 217 was at the end of the hall, one of our isolation rooms with glass walls, so we could monitor critical patients. That night, I was assigned to Mr. Harrison, a 78-year-old man dying from complications after a massive stroke. His family had said their goodbyes earlier that evening, and we all knew he wouldn't make it to morning. Around 2 in the morning, I was adjusting his 4 when he suddenly grabbed my wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong for someone so close to the end. His eyes, which had been unfocused for hours, locked onto mine with startling clarity. "She's here," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the ventilator's rhythmic breathing. "The lady in blue. She says it's almost time." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to stay professional. Dying patients often hallucinate, especially in the ICU where the medications and lack of proper sleep can cause confusion. I looked around the room, which was empty except for us. The glass walls showed the dimly lit hallway beyond, and the nurse's station where my colleague Sarah was documenting charts. "There's no one here but me, Mr. Harrison," I said gently, trying to comfort him. But he shook his head slowly, his eyes moving to the chair beside his bed. "She's right there," he insisted. "Blue dress, silver hair in a bun. She's holding my hand." I looked at the empty chair and saw nothing, but the way he described her, with such specific detail, made my skin prickle. Mr. Harrison passed away 40 minutes later. His monitor flatlined while I was checking on another patient, and when I rushed back, I found him with the most peaceful expression I'd ever seen on a dying patient's face. His hand was stretched out toward that empty chair, fingers curled as if holding someone else's hand. I documented everything according to protocol, but I couldn't shake the image of him reaching for someone I couldn't see. 2 weeks later, we had another critical patient in room 217. Mrs. Chun, a 62-year-old woman with end-stage liver failure. She spoke very little English, mostly Mandarin, which her daughter translated for us. On her 2nd night in the ICU, I was making my rounds when I heard her talking animatedly in Mandarin. Through the glass, I could see her gesturing at the same chair Mr. Harrison had pointed to. She seemed to be having a conversation with someone, nodding and occasionally smiling despite her pain. Her daughter arrived for an early morning visit, and I mentioned that her mother had been very talkative during the night. The daughter looked confused. "My mother was talking? To who?" When I explained what I'd observed, she went pale. She spoke rapidly to her mother in Mandarin, and Mrs. Chen responded with obvious excitement. The daughter turned to me, her voice shaking. She says an old woman in a blue dress has been sitting with her all night. The woman doesn't speak, but my mother says she understands everything anyway. She says the woman's presence makes her feel safe. That's when I started paying closer attention to room 217. I began keeping my own unofficial log of what patients reported. Over the next 3 months, 7 more critical patients occupied that room. 5 of them, completely independent of each other, described the same visitor. An elderly woman, maybe in her 70s or 80s, with silver hair always pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a blue dress that one patient described as old-fashioned, like from the 1980s. She never spoke, but her presence seemed to bring immense comfort to those who saw her. The 2 patients who didn't report seeing her, they were the only ones who survived and were eventually transferred to regular rooms. It was as if she only appeared for those who truly needed her, those who were approaching their final moments. This pattern was too consistent to ignore, and it was starting to affect me. I found myself checking that chair whenever I entered room 217, half expecting to see someone sitting there. One particularly busy night, We had a young man named Tyler in room 217. 23 years old, motorcycle accident, massive internal bleeding that the surgeons couldn't stop. His parents were devastated, crying in the hallway while we did everything we could. Tyler was conscious but fading fast. I was adjusting his pain medication when he looked past me and smiled. Not the confused smile of someone on heavy medications, but a genuine, peaceful smile. "Tell her thank you," he said to me. "Tell the lady in blue I'm ready." I turned around, and for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, I could have sworn I saw something. A shimmer in the air by the chair, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. The faintest outline of a figure. But when I blinked, it was gone. Tyler died 15 minutes later, holding his mother's hand in mine, but his eyes were fixed on that chair until the very end. That incident shook me enough that I had to know more. I started researching the history of room 217, spending my breaks in the hospital's archive room, which was really just a dusty basement storage area filled with old files and records. The hospital had been built in 1952, and room 217 had always been part of the ICU, even through multiple renovations. I found nothing unusual in the architectural records or incident reports. But then I started looking through old employee records, and that's when I found her, Margaret Eleanor Thomlinson. Hired as a volunteer in 1957, she had dedicated 30 years of her life to Riverside General Hospital. The black and white photograph attached to her file showed a woman with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a bun. But it was the notation about her uniform that made my blood run cold. Volunteer uniform, standard blue dress, style #4B. The same blue dress our dying patients described. I stared at that photograph, at her gentle smile, and felt like she was looking right back at me. Margaret's file was thick with commendations and letters of appreciation. She had spent most of her volunteer hours in the ICU, specifically requesting to sit with dying patients who had no family present. The nurses from that era had written glowing reviews about her. Margaret has an extraordinary ability to comfort our most critical patients. Her presence brings peace to those facing their final hours. She never leaves until they pass, no matter how long it takes. Page after page described a woman who had made it her mission to ensure no one died alone. The last entry in her file was dated October 15, 1987. Margaret had been sitting with a patient in the ICU when she suffered a massive heart attack. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who had comforted so many in their final moments had faced her own in the very place she had served. The room number where she died was partially obscured by a water stain on the paper, but I could make out enough. Room 217. She had died in room 217. I sat in that dusty archive room, holding Margaret's file, and everything clicked into place. She had spent 30 years making sure no one died alone, and somehow, she was still doing it. Death hadn't stopped her mission. It had just changed how she carried it out, but knowing this didn't make it less unsettling. If anything, it raised more questions. How is this possible? Why room 217? And why could dying patients see her when the rest of us couldn't? I returned to my shift that night with Margaret's story weighing heavily on my mind. I found myself standing outside room 217, which was temporarily empty, staring at that chair. I thought about all the patients who had described her, the comfort she had brought them. Part of me wanted to say something, to acknowledge her presence somehow, but I felt foolish talking to an empty room. Still, I whispered a quiet thank you before returning to my rounds. 3 days later, we admitted Mr. Rodriguez, a 55-year-old construction worker with severe complications from COVID-19. His oxygen levels were critically low, and we had to intubate him immediately. His wife couldn't visit due to isolation protocols, and she was devastated. She called every hour, begging for updates, crying because she couldn't be with him. It broke my heart telling her he had to face this alone. But he wasn't alone. Through the glass walls of room 217, during my 3 a.m. rounds, I saw Mr. Rodriguez's hand moving slightly, his fingers curling and uncurling as if holding something. His vital signs, which had been erratic all night, suddenly stabilized. Not enough to save him, but enough to give him peace. When I entered the room, the air felt different. Warmer somehow, despite the cold hospital climate control. And there was a smell, very faint, like lavender and old books. It reminded me of my grandmother's house. Mr. Rodriguez died at dawn, but his face was serene. When I called his wife to deliver the news, she was sobbing so hard she could barely speak. But I told her something that wasn't in any medical protocol. I told her he wasn't alone. I couldn't explain the details, couldn't tell her about Margaret without sounding insane, but I assured her that someone had been with him. The relief in her voice, the way she kept saying thank you, still brings tears to my eyes. Word started spreading among the ICU staff about room 217. Not officially, of course. We're medical professionals. We don't officially believe in ghosts. But unofficially, nurses would whisper about the lady in blue. Some had experiences similar to mine, glimpsing something out of the corner of their eye, feeling a presence in the room, noticing that specific patients in 217 died more peacefully than those in other rooms. Dr. Williams, our head of ICU, was a strict rationalist who dismissed any talk of paranormal activity. But even he admitted that patients in room 217 had statistically significant better end-of-life experiences, though he attributed it to the room's location and lighting. Then came the night that changed everything for me. We had an elderly woman named Agnes in room 217, 91 years old, dying from multiple organ failure. She had been a nurse herself, decades ago, and she was completely lucid despite her body shutting down. I was adjusting her pillows when she grabbed my hand. "You can see her too, can't you?" she asked. I started to give my standard response about hallucinations, but she cut me off. "Don't lie to a dying woman, dear. I know Margaret. I worked with her." My heart nearly stopped. Agnes had been a nurse at Riverside General from 1959 to 1995. She had known Margaret personally. "She was the kindest soul," Agnes continued, her voice weak but clear. "Always stayed late, never complained, held more hands than any of us. When she died, we all said the hospital lost its heart." Agnes paused, looking at the chair. "But she never really left, did she? She's still here, still doing what she always did." I couldn't speak, could only nod. Agnes smiled. "Tell her I said hello. Tell her I'll see her on the other side." Agnes passed away 2 hours later, and just before she died, she laughed softly. "She says she's been waiting for me," Agnes whispered. "All these years, and she still remembers my favorite joke about the doctor and the duck." I didn't know what joke she meant, but the joy on her face was unmistakable. After Agnes died, I went back to the archives and found a newspaper clipping from 1960. It was a photo from the hospital's Christmas party. There was young Agnes, laughing at something off camera, and beside her, with her arm around Agnes's shoulders, was Margaret. This revelation led me to interview other longtime hospital employees. Betty from housekeeping, who'd been here for 40 years, remembered Margaret. "Sweetest woman you'd ever meet," she told me. "Always brought cookies for the staff, handmade quilts for patients who were cold." When she died, it was like the lights dimmed in this place. Tom from maintenance had similar memories. She'd stay all night sometimes if someone was dying alone. Her husband would bring her dinner because she refused to leave. That was just Margaret. The more I learned about Margaret's life, the more her continued presence made sense. This wasn't just a job for her, it was a calling. She had found her purpose in those rooms, holding hands and offering comfort when people needed it most. Death hadn't ended that purpose, it had just transformed it. But understanding didn't make it less extraordinary. We had a ghost, a benevolent spirit, whatever you want to call it, actively comforting our dying patients. How do you put that in a medical chart? 6 months after I first encountered Margaret's presence, we had a particularly difficult case. A 7-year-old girl named Emma with acute leukemia. Her parents were destroyed, taking shifts so someone was always with her. But on her last night, her father had collapsed from exhaustion and was admitted to the ER, and her mother was stuck in traffic during a snowstorm, desperately trying to get back to the hospital. Emma was alone, scared, crying for her mommy. I stayed with her, holding her tiny hand, but she was terrified. Then she suddenly stopped crying. She looked past me and smiled. "Is that your grandma?" she asked me. I told her I didn't have anyone else in the room. "The nice lady in the blue dress," Emma said. "She looks like a grandma. She's pretty." Emma's fear melted away. She started talking to the empty chair, telling Margaret about her stuffed elephant, her favorite cartoon, her dog Max. For 20 minutes, this dying child chatted happily with someone I couldn't see, until her mother finally burst through the door, covered in snow, sobbing with relief that she'd made it in time. Emma died in her mother's arms an hour later, but she wasn't afraid. Her last words were, "The blue lady says I'll be okay." Her mother looked at me, confused and desperate, and I told her the truth. I told her about Margaret, about all the patients who had seen her, about the comfort she brought. I expected skepticism or anger, but instead, Emma's mother hugged me. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for telling me she wasn't alone." That night fundamentally changed how I viewed my work. We spend so much time in medicine focusing on saving lives that we sometimes forget about the importance of a good death. Margaret understood this in life, and somehow she still understands it now. She appears for those who need her most, offering the one thing medicine can't always provide: the assurance that we don't face our final moments alone. I started documenting every Margaret sighting more carefully, creating an unofficial record. Over 2 years, I logged 43 separate incidents. Patients from different backgrounds, speaking different languages with different beliefs, all describing the same woman. The consistency was remarkable. Blue dress, silver hair in a bun, kind eyes, never speaks but somehow communicates comfort. Always in the chair beside the bed. Only appears to those who will die within hours. One night, I tried an experiment. We had a terminal patient in room 217, and I placed a motion sensor camera in the corner, hoping to capture something. I reviewed the footage the next morning. The patient had clearly been talking to someone, gesturing at the chair, even reaching out to hold an invisible hand. But the camera showed nothing. No figure, no movement, not even an unexplained shadow. Whatever Margaret is, she exists beyond what our technology can detect. Dr. Williams eventually confronted me about my obsession with room 217. He'd heard the stories circulating among staff and was concerned about maintaining professional standards. I showed him my documentation, the consistent patient reports, Margaret's employee file. He reviewed everything with his typical skepticism, then sat quietly for a long moment. Finally, he said, "I don't believe in ghosts, but I believe in unexplained phenomena that bring comfort to dying patients. If room 217 has some quality that eases suffering, we don't interfere with it." It was the closest he'd ever come to acknowledging Margaret's presence. The breaking point came when my own grandmother was admitted to the ICU with pneumonia that quickly progressed to sepsis. She was 87, fragile, and declining rapidly. Room 217 was occupied, so she was in room 214. I spent every break with her, watching her struggle, seeing her fear. She kept asking if she was going to die, and I couldn't lie to her. On her third night, room 217 became available. I'm not proud of this, but I pulled strings to have her moved there. Within an hour of being in room 217, my grandmother's whole demeanor changed. She stopped asking about death, stopped being afraid. She looked at that chair and smiled. "What a lovely woman," she said. "She reminds me of my mother." My grandmother had been anxious and restless for days, but now she was peaceful. She held conversations with the empty chair, sometimes laughing at unheard responses. She died the next morning, holding my hand, but her eyes were on Margaret until the end. Her last words were, "She says it's beautiful there." Losing my grandmother was devastating, but knowing Margaret had been with her brought me indescribable comfort. It also made me realize that Margaret's presence wasn't just about the dying. It was about those of us left behind. Knowing our loved ones don't die alone, knowing someone guides them through that final transition, helps us process our grief. Margaret's gift extends beyond death, touching the living who must continue on. I've been working in the ICU for 12 years now, and Margaret is as much a part of room 217 as the bed and monitors. New nurses eventually hear the stories and either believe or don't, but they all notice that room 217 is different. Patients die more peacefully there. Families seem more comforted. Even the skeptics admit there's something special about that room. Last month, we had a young nurse named Jessica start her ICU rotation. She was assigned to room 217 on her third night, caring for an elderly man with heart failure. Around 4 a.m., she came to me, pale and shaking. "There's someone in there with Mr. Patterson," she whispered. But I didn't see anyone go in. I asked her to describe what she saw. "I can't really see her clearly," Jessica said. "It's like looking through frosted glass. But there's definitely someone in that chair. Blue dress, I think. Silver hair." This was extraordinary. Jessica had no knowledge of Margaret's story. We don't tell new staff about her for this exact reason. We don't want to influence their perceptions. Yet she had glimpsed what dozens of dying patients had seen clearly. I told Jessica about Margaret, showed her the old photograph. She stared at it for a long time, then said, "That's her. That's who's in there." Mr. Patterson died that morning, and Jessica held his hand while Margaret held his spirit, or soul, or whatever part of us continues on. I've thought a lot about why Margaret chose to stay, or was allowed to stay, or however it works. Maybe it's unfinished business, though that seems too simplistic. Margaret's business was never finished. There would always be someone dying alone who needed comfort. Maybe she loved her work so much that death couldn't separate her from it. Or maybe, just maybe, this is how the universe works. Maybe those who dedicate their lives to compassion get to continue that work in ways we don't understand. Sometimes I wonder if Margaret knows we know about her. Does she see us seeing her, or trying to? Is she aware that her story has become legend in these halls? I like to think she knows, and that she's pleased her work is recognized, even if she never sought recognition in life. She just wanted to help, and she's still helping 40 years after her own death. The strangest incident happened just last week. We had a 95-year-old woman named Dorothy in room 217. She had been a nurse at Riverside General in the 1950s, and had actually trained Margaret when she first started volunteering. Dorothy was barely conscious, drifting in and out, but suddenly she opened her eyes wide and laughed. "Margaret, you haven't aged a day," she exclaimed. Then, clear as anything, she said, "I'm so glad you're the one who came for me. Full circle, isn't it?" Dorothy passed away minutes later, but her words stuck with me. Full circle. Margaret had learned about comforting the dying from nurses like Dorothy, and now she was returning that kindness. It made me wonder how many former colleagues Margaret had guided over the years, how many people who had known her in life had been reunited with her in death. The thought was both beautiful and haunting. I've tried to research other hospitals to see if they have similar phenomena, but nothing quite matches what we have with Margaret. There are stories of ghostly nurses, of comforting presences, but nothing as consistent, as documented as ours. Margaret is unique, or at least her continued presence is. She's not a frightening ghost or a residual haunting. She's an active, conscious presence who continues the work she loved. Some people ask me if I'm afraid of room 217, if Margaret's presence disturbs me. The truth is, she's the least frightening thing in the ICU. Death is frightening. Suffering is frightening. Watching families say goodbye is frightening. But Margaret? She's the opposite of frightening. She's proof that love and compassion transcend death, that dedication to helping others doesn't end with our last breath. If anything, she makes me less afraid of my own eventual death, knowing that someone like her might be waiting to guide me through it. I've seen Margaret's impact on hundreds of patients now. Each story is unique, but the common thread is always comfort. The terrified become peaceful. The alone feel accompanied. The restless find rest. She doesn't discriminate, young or old, religious or atheist, good people or those with troubled pasts. If you're dying in room 217, Margaret will be there for you. It's as simple and as miraculous as that. Recently, the hospital administration has been discussing renovations to the ICU. There's talk of modernizing room 217, gutting it completely and rebuilding. The thought terrifies me. What if Margaret is somehow tied to the physical space? What if destroying the room means losing her? I've been subtly campaigning to preserve the room's structure, using medical arguments about not disrupting a space that provides measurably better end-of-life experiences. So far, the administration seems receptive, though they don't know the real reason for my concern. I think about Margaret often, about the life she lived and the existence she has now. Did she choose this, or was it chosen for her? Does she ever rest, or is she always on duty? Is she lonely, or does she find fulfillment in her continued service? These questions have no answers, but they remind me that there's so much about death and what comes after that we don't understand. Margaret is proof that death isn't the end, though what exactly it is the beginning of remains a mystery. Every nurse in our ICU has their own Margaret story now. Sarah saw her reflection in a window once. Tom felt a hand on his shoulder while comforting a dying patient, but no one was there. Lisa smelled lavender in room 217 when we had no flowers or scented products anywhere nearby. We don't talk about it with outsiders much. Who would believe us? But among ourselves, Margaret is as real as any living colleague. I sometimes leave small tokens in room 217, just in case Margaret can appreciate them. A flower on the bedside table. A thank you note tucked behind the chair. I know it might be silly, but it feels important to acknowledge her, to let her know she's not forgotten. Once, I left a photo of the current ICU staff with a note saying, "We remember you, Margaret." The next morning, the photo had been moved slightly, turned to face the chair. Probably just the cleaning crew, but I choose to believe otherwise. The most profound experience I've had with Margaret happened 6 months ago. I was having a terrible shift. We'd lost 3 patients in one night, all young, all tragedies that shouldn't have happened. I was in the break room, crying, questioning whether I could keep doing this job. The ICU was quiet, and room 217 was empty. I found myself standing in there, in the dark, overwhelmed by grief and exhaustion. I sat in Margaret's chair, the one where she always appears, and I talked to the darkness. I told her about my doubts, my fears, the weight of watching so much death. I asked her how she did it for 30 years, how she found the strength to keep showing up. There was no response, no ghostly appearance, but suddenly I felt warm. Not physically warm, but emotionally, spiritually warm. It was like being wrapped in the safest, most comforting embrace. The feeling lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it changed everything. I understood that Margaret didn't see death as an ending, but as a transition, and her role was to make that transition gentle. It wasn't about the strength to face death, it was about the love to ease suffering. Since then, I've approached my work differently. I'm not just providing medical care, I'm participating in something sacred. Every patient who passes through room 217 becomes part of Margaret's story, and Margaret's story has become part of mine. She's taught me, without words, that death doesn't have to be feared if it's met with compassion. She's shown me that love is stronger than death, that kindness echoes through eternity. As I write this, there's a patient in room 217 right now. Mrs. Yamamoto, 93 years old, was a teacher for 50 years. Her children are with her, but I know Margaret is there too. I can see it in Mrs. Yamamoto's eyes, the way they track something the rest of us can't see, the peace that settled over her face. Her daughter asked me why her mother keeps looking at the empty chair and smiling. I told her the truth, that someone very special is keeping her mother company, someone who's been doing this for a very long time. The daughter looked at me strangely, then asked, "Is it the lady in blue my mother keeps mentioning?" When I nodded, she didn't seem frightened or skeptical. Instead, tears rolled down her face as she whispered, "Thank God. I was so worried she'd be scared." That's Margaret's true gift, not just comforting the dying, but bringing peace to the living who must let them go. Working in the ICU means living with death as a constant companion. It can break you, harden you, or if you're lucky enough to work near room 217, it can teach you that death isn't the enemy we think it is. Margaret has shown me that death can be gentle, that no one has to face it alone, and that love transcends the physical boundaries we think are absolute. She's proof that dedication to others doesn't end with our last heartbeat. I don't know how long Margaret will continue her work. Maybe forever. Maybe until the hospital is torn down. Maybe until she feels her mission is complete, though I can't imagine when that would be. All I know is that tonight, tomorrow, and for as long as room 217 exists, she'll be there. Sitting in that chair, wearing her blue dress, her silver hair in a perfect bun, holding the hands of those who are leaving this world, assuring them that they're not alone. Sometimes people ask me if I believe in life after death now, having witnessed Margaret's presence for so many years. My answer is always the same. I don't just believe in it, I've seen it. I've seen it in the peace on dying faces, in the comfort of grieving families, in the consistency of Margaret's appearances. She's not just a ghost or a spirit. She's evidence that consciousness, love, and purpose continue beyond what we understand as death. Last week, I was training a new nurse, showing her the ropes of night shift ICU work. We stopped outside room 217, where an elderly man was sleeping fitfully. "This room is special," I told her, then caught myself. Was I really going to tell this bright-eyed new graduate about our resident ghost? But looking at her eager face, I realized she deserved to know. So I told her about Margaret, about the comfort she brings, about the peace she provides. The new nurse listened, then surprised me by saying, "My grandmother was a patient here in 1985. She always said an angel in blue held her hand when she thought she was dying. She survived, but she never forgot that presence." These connections happen more often than you'd think. Margaret touched so many lives during her 30 years of service, and she's touched exponentially more in the decades since her death. Her legacy isn't just in the patients she's comforted, but in the ripples of peace that spread from each interaction. Families tell stories of the mysterious woman in blue. Nurses carry her memory to other hospitals. The legend of Margaret grows, but at its heart, it remains simple. One woman's dedication to ensuring no one dies alone. As I finish this story, it's 3 a.m., and I'm at the nurse's station. Room 217 is visible from here, its glass walls revealing the elderly woman inside, her family gathered around her bed. But I know there's someone else there too, someone only she can see clearly. The woman's face is peaceful, occasionally smiling at something beyond her family's perception. Her hand rests on the arm of the chair, fingers occasionally moving as if patting someone's hand. This is Margaret's gift to us, the knowledge that death isn't a solitary journey. In room 217, every ending is accompanied, every transition is guided, every last breath is witnessed with compassion. She reminds us that the most profound human connections transcend physical presence, that love and kindness leave impressions that death cannot erase. Even now, after all these years, I sometimes catch myself looking for her. A glimpse of blue in my peripheral vision, a hint of lavender in the air, the feeling of being watched when I'm alone in room 217. I've never seen her clearly, not like the dying do, but I feel her presence. It's comforting to know she's there, maintaining her vigil, continuing her mission. In a world that often feels harsh and unpredictable, Margaret is a constant, a reminder that compassion endures, that some people's purpose is so strong that even death cannot stop them from fulfilling it. So if you ever find yourself in an ICU, facing the unthinkable, remember Margaret's story. Remember that there are forces of comfort we don't fully understand, presences that guide us through our darkest moments. And if you're ever in Riverside General Hospital, in room 217, and you see an elderly woman in a blue dress sitting in the chair beside the bed, don't be afraid. That's just Margaret, doing what she's always done, ensuring that no one faces their final moments alone. Even now, I wonder if Margaret knows how many lives she's touched, how many tears she's dried, how many fears she's calmed. Does she understand that she's become more than just a volunteer, more than just a ghost? She's become a symbol of hope, proof that love transcends death, evidence that our purpose can outlive our bodies. What do you think happens when we dedicate our lives so completely to helping others that even death can't stop us? Is Margaret unique, or are there others like her, invisible guardians easing suffering in hospitals around the world? I'll never have all the answers, but I know this. Room 217 will never truly be empty as long as Margaret keeps her watch. And somewhere right now, in that quiet room at the end of the hall, she's holding someone's hand, guiding them gently into whatever comes next. Even now, I wonder if it was real, but I know it was. What do you think?